Providence's rivers whispered with strange tides. Beneath the surface, he imagined something sleeping.
A cold mist hung over Providence that night. The kind of mist that softens the edges of the world, blurs the lamps, and makes even the most familiar street look like a place never walked before. The old gas lamps burned with a weak glow, their light swallowed by the air as if the fog itself was hungry. Brick streets wound across the hill like veins, wet with dew, echoing under the steps of those who dared to walk alone. The houses stood close, too close, as though they leaned toward one another, whispering secrets between their walls. Their windows flickered with faint glimmers, yet in many, no one stirred. To pass through them at night was to feel eyes without faces watching from behind the curtains. The city seemed ordinary by day, a picture of colonial pride and old-world charm. Yet once night fell, Providence changed. It breathed differently. Its rhythm slowed into something that belonged not to the living, but to memory. Even the air carried a weight, like centuries pressing down on those who wandered the dark. Some swore the city never truly slept. For even in dawn's first light, the shadows did not retreat. They clung stubbornly, stretching long across the cobblestones, lingering in the corners of buildings, as if bound to the place by something older than time. In the heart of this strange city, on a street where lamplight never seemed strong enough to chase the dark, a boy was born. His name was Howard Phillips Lovecraft. He came into the world pale and fragile, his cries sharp but fleeting, as if he too already knew silence would follow him more closely than laughter. His city did not welcome him with warmth. Instead, Providence surrounded him with its unshakable presence, its shadows, its endless echoes of history. The boy did not choose this, but Providence had already marked him. Those who knew the city well understood its nature. Providence was old even when it was young, founded by exiles, scarred by storms, burned by fire, rebuilt with brick and stone. The city carried a memory of every wound it ever suffered. People walked its streets with pride, yet they always felt the unseen beneath their feet, a kind of whisper in the soil that spoke of things buried too deep to be unearthed. Children heard stories of ghosts in the graveyards, of voices in the river, of strangers who appeared on foggy nights and vanished by morning. For most, these were only tales to be dismissed with a smile. For one child, however, these whispers would shape an entire life. Providence was a city that clung to the imagination. Its churches rose like spires into the gray skies, their bells tolling not just for the living, but for the dead. Its narrow alleys, framed with crooked brick walls, looked like passages designed not for men, but for something far older. Its graveyard spread like maps of forgotten families, stone markers sinking into the earth as if even the ground grew weary of remembering. The river split and curved, cutting through the city like veins of dark water, carrying with it not only the reflection of stars, but the suggestion of something swimming deeper than sight allowed. On nights when the fog was heaviest, Providence seemed to shift in shape. Streets twisted into endless paths. Buildings rose taller than they should. Lights blurred into faint signals, guiding nowhere. And in those hours, the city felt alive, as though it were not built by men but had grown from the soil itself. A city of bone and shadow disguised as stone and brick. It was in this place that Lovecraft's eyes first opened. He was not like other children, where they saw only streets. He saw labyrinths. Where they saw houses, he saw watchers. Where they saw silence, he heard voices beneath the wind. He grew within the arms of a city that whispered to him from the very beginning. He wandered the same streets others passed without notice, yet he felt the weight of each shadow and the pull of every grave. For him, Providence was not simply a home. It was a story already being written. Stories from neighbors told his quiet nature, how he kept himself, how he carried the look of someone always listening, even when no one spoke. His eyes seemed to search the corners of rooms where others saw nothing. His nights were filled with dreams, or rather visions, that left him trembling by morning. He would later write of cosmic terrors, beings beyond human reach. But some wondered if he had not simply borrowed them from his sleep. Perhaps they had been there all along, watching, choosing him. The gas lamps of Providence burned through his youth, marking each night with their faint glow. He would walk beneath them, his pale face lifted to the yellow light, shadows curling along the bricks at his feet. Sometimes he would stop, staring at the corners of houses, as if something had just slipped out of sight. Other times he would linger near the graveyards, his breath forming clouds in the cold night air, as though he waited for ground itself to stir. And the city, always the city, was there with him. Providence shaped his mind with its gloom, fed his imagination with its silence, and carved into him a vision of worlds no other child dared to imagine. To most, it was a place of work, of school, of markets and churches. To him, it was alive. It was an old guardian of secrets that whispered only to those who listened. The shadows of Providence lingered in every story he would later write. But in these first years, as the fog rolled heavy and the lamps flickered weakly against night, no one could guess what the city had awakened in the boy. He was fragile in body, yet strong in the strange world that grew behind his eyes. He was silent in public, yet his dreams carried voices from depths unknown. He was ordinary to those who passed him by, yet within him stirred the beginnings of horrors that would one day change the way the world thought of fear. Providence had given him life, but it had also given him something else, something ancient, something unseen, a shadow that would never leave him. The city of shadows had claimed its child, and in return, the child would carry those shadows to the world. The boy grew in silence. He was pale, thin, and restless, wandering streets that most children crossed quickly without a second thought. While others chased games and laughter, he walked alone, always with his eyes fixed on places that adults said were too strange for children. There was something about him that never seemed ordinary, something that marked him as a child who listened too deeply, who stared too long, who carried with him the weight of things unspoken. When he walked to the heart of Providence, his steps always pulled him toward corners hidden in shadow. He lingered near doorways where the air turned colder, and he paused at alleys that narrowed into blackness. His curiosity never rushed. It lingered, as though he waited for the walls themselves to lean down and speak to him. The city was alive for him in a way it was not for others. At Swan Point Cemetery, he could often be found standing still for long stretches of time. His small figure among towering gravestones looked almost spectral itself, as if he belonged more with the dead than the living. The gravestones leaned, cracked, and faded, names half forgotten by the families who once wept there. Yet he stared at them with an intensity far beyond his years. His hand would rest on cold stone, tracing letters that had nearly vanished. The elm trees bent overhead, their branches creaking in the wind, and in that sound he swore he heard voices. Whispers that rolled through the leaves like secrets meant only for him. Adults who noticed him at the cemetery often shook their heads. They said it was morbid for a child to linger in such a place. But he returned again and again, as though the graves were classrooms and the dead were his teachers. What did he learn there? No one could ever truly say. Yet from those hours among the stones, something grew in him, a vision of a world larger and darker than the one most men would ever accept. His nights were worse. In his dreams, he saw things that made even the bravest men shudder when he described them later. Shapes without form, creatures without faces, landscapes without sun or end. He spoke of voids so endless that they erased all sense of time, and of beings whose presence pressed against his small body, like the weight of oceans. These were not the dreams of a child who had seen too many fairy tales. These were visions that belonged to some other realm, too large, too cruel, too cold. Sometimes he would wake in the middle of the night, unable to move, his body frozen, his breath shallow, his eyes wide. And in those moments, he swore he felt something crawling along the walls, inching toward his bed. He would hear faint scratching, though when morning came, the walls were smooth and empty. Adults dismissed it as imagination, but he knew it was something more. The city, he thought, did not sleep, and neither did the things that lived within its unseen layers. Other children avoided him. They sensed the strangeness, the stillness in him. They laughed and played in sunlight while he wandered through shade, collecting sights and sounds that no one else seemed to notice. When they saw a row of houses, he saw guardians with watchful eyes. When they crossed a bridge, he felt as though the waters beneath were whispering curses. And when they looked at him, some felt a chill, as though his pale gaze carried a reflection of the void he dreamed of each night. His family life offered little comfort. Madness lingered in his bloodline, shadowing his childhood home with grief. His father was lost to illness of the mind. His mother wept and whispered, her own thoughts tangled with sorrow. In that environment, silence grew thicker and fear settled into the walls. Yet instead of breaking him, the gloom sharpened his senses. Where others crumbled under despair, he learned to listen to the darkness, to take its whispers and carry them inside his imagination. Every detail of Providence seemed to feed his restless spirit. The narrow streets curled into shapes that felt less like paths and more like puzzles. The old houses, with their crooked roofs and shuttered windows, felt alive with watching. The cemeteries, countless and cold, reminded him that life was always pressed against death. He did not see the city as others did. For him, Providence was not a backdrop. It was a living force, a presence that shaped him like stone carved a river's flow. On stormy nights, he would press himself against a window and stare into the rain-soaked streets. Lightning revealed the angles of buildings in sharp, sudden flashes, and in those brief illuminations, he swore he saw shapes standing still. Not men, not animals, but outlines that vanished when thunder rolled. He did not tell others. He simply memorized them, stored them in the chambers of his mind, and later transformed them into words. His imagination was not a shield from reality. It was an extension of it. Where others closed their eyes to forget, he opened his to remember. Each nightmare became a seed for stories. Each whisper in the trees became a verse of horror. Each shadow in the fog became a hint of something larger, older, and colder than humanity itself. Teachers noticed he was different. While others learned by rote, he wandered in thought, his notebooks filled not with lessons but sketches of strange towers and alien skies. He wrote verses that carried sadness too heavy for his age. Some thought him fragile, but others whispered he was touched by something beyond. And as he grew, so too did the visions. The haunted child of Providence became a collector of silence, a keeper of shadows. He carried with him the weight of nightmares that most would never confess. He did not resist them. He welcomed them, because deep inside he knew that they were his gift. They set him apart. They gave him purpose. They marked him as one who would tell stories others could not imagine. But the price of such visions was heavy. Sleep never brought rest. Joy never lingered. His friendships were fleeting, his laughter faint. He walked always with the burden of seeing too much, of sensing what lay beyond the thin veil of ordinary life. And though he did not yet understand it fully, he knew that Providence itself was his guide, his tormentor, his teacher. The child that others pitied or avoided was already shaping into something remarkable. His haunted childhood was no accident. It was preparation. The city had whispered to him since birth. Through dreams, through voices in the trees, through shadows in the cemeteries. What others dismissed as imagination was for him the foundation of a world he would one day bring to life. In the end, it was not a lonely boy wandering the streets of Providence. It was a mind being shaped by forces unseen. A child chosen, or perhaps cursed, to hear what others could not. A child who carried within him the seed of horrors too vast for the world to bear. And though no one could see it then, those silent walks, those long hours by graves, those sleepless nights staring into shadows, were beginnings of something unforgettable. A legacy born not from comfort or joy, but from fear, silence, and visions that reach beyond the stars. Providence had given him a childhood unlike any other, a haunted childhood, one that would echo through every word he would later write, one that would ensure his name would never be forgotten. For the pale boy who listened to whispers no one else heard was not merely a dreamer. He was becoming the voice of nightmares that would outlive even the city itself. The house on Angel Street stood with quiet dignity, yet there was always something unsettling about it. From the outside, it seemed like any other family home in Providence. Its windows reflected the light of the sun by day and glimmered faintly at night when the lamps along the street flickered in the mist. But those who passed by would sometimes pause, feeling a strange weight, as if the air grew heavier when they stood before its door. Neighbors whispered that the house was cursed, though few would say it loudly. It was not the kind of curse spoken of in fairy tales. It was a presence, a heaviness that seemed to seep through brick and wood, a memory that lived in the walls. For young Howard, The house was no refuge. Within its rooms, silence stretched in unnatural ways. Doors creaked even when no one touched them. Shadows in corners clung longer than the light should have allowed. At night, when the rest of the family tried to rest, he lay awake, paralyzed by dread he could not name. His bed became a prison, his small frame held down by an invisible weight. His eyes, wide and frozen, stared at the ceiling as he felt something moving along the walls. It crawled without shape, faceless yet watchful, like a thought that had grown claws. He could not scream. He could not call for help. He could only listen to the scratching, soft but steady, as though the house itself was alive. When morning came, the walls would show no mark, no sign of intrusion. Adults told him it was only a dream. But the boy knew the difference between a dream and something real. He carried the memory of those nights in his trembling breath, in the sweat that soaked his sheets, in the fear that did not leave even when the sun rose. Each night, it returned, as though the house itself demanded his fear as payment for shelter. The family suffered within those walls. His father's mind collapsed, leaving him lost to an asylum. His mother's grief turned inward, breaking her spirit piece by piece until her whispers filled the rooms with sorrow. The boy listened to her fragile voice as she walked the halls, speaking to no one, speaking to herself, speaking perhaps to the same shadows that haunted his own nights. Madness and loss seemed to seep through the family like water through cracked stone. Yet the house did not simply witness this sorrow. It absorbed it. Neighbors noticed. They said the house carried an atmosphere of mourning, as if grief itself had been built into its foundation. Visitors often left quickly, unsettled by a heaviness they could not explain. Some claimed the walls gave off a faint sound like distant breathing. Others said the house felt colder the longer one remained inside. To them, it was cursed. To the boy, it was home, a home that shaped him, pressed on him, and filled him with visions that would never leave. The rooms of the house were not kind. The parlor, once meant for gatherings, felt too large, as if voices echoed even when no one spoke. The stairway groaned with each step, as a warning against climb. His bedroom carried the deepest shadows, shadows that never lifted, shadows that seemed to listen when he moved. Sometimes he would wake to find the air thick, as though something invisible stood beside his bed. He would hold his breath, waiting until the weight passed. Yet it never truly left. It lingered, patient, as if the house itself had chosen him. Years passed, and the boy grew, but the grip of the house did not ease. He continued to feel the press of unseen forces, the crawling sense that eyes without faces tracked his movements. In those long nights, he began to wonder if the house remembered, if each cry of grief, each whispered prayer, each silent tear had been taken in by the walls and stored like echoes. Perhaps the wood and stone no longer belonged to the family at all, but to the sorrow itself. He began to write, with trembling hands. He shaped words to match the fears that lived inside him. Stories of faceless beings. Stories of houses that breathed. Stories of curses that fed on memory. He wrote not only to escape, but to understand. Yet the more he wrote, the more he realized the house was not simply inspiring him. It was speaking through him. For the neighbors, the house on Angel Street became a place to avoid. Children dared one another to walk past it after dark, but few were brave enough to linger. Adults crossed the street rather than pass too close to its shadow. The curse of the house was not only in what it did to those within, but also in how it marked itself upon those outside. Providence was filled with old homes, yet this one carried an aura that could not be ignored. Inside, Howard continued to endure the long nights of paralysis. His eyes would open in the dark, and the same crawling presence would return, sliding along the walls, inching toward him. Sometimes he thought he could see it in the corner, a blur darker than the rest of the shadow. Other times he only felt it, pressing against his chest, making his breath short. He did not cry out. He learned to wait, still and silent, until morning broke and the presence withdrew. But the fear it left behind never faded when his mother's mind began to break. Her voice carried through the house in ways that made the walls tremble. She spoke to unseen figures, warning him of dangers she could not name, whispering of curses that no one else believed. Her sorrow and madness seemed to fill every corner. And when she finally left the world, it was as if the house sighed in relief, only to grow heavier again with the silence she left behind. Howard was left with the memory of it all. The house had not only given him shelter, it had carved him into what he was becoming. It had shown him horrors before he could understand their meaning. It had wrapped him in shadows and pressed his mind against the edges of unseen worlds. He carried its curse within him, and in return, he gave it voice through his writing. Even when he later left Angel Street, the memory of the house followed. The creak of its stairs, the whispers in its walls, the faceless presence that crawled at night. All of it lived in him as if he had never truly escaped. The house was not just a building. It was a spirit, a force, a haunting. It had absorbed madness and sorrow, and it had given those things to the boy in return. To others, it was simply cursed. To him, it was a beginning, a place where shadows became real, where silence became alive, where grief became eternal. The house on Angel Street was not just where he lived. It was where the horrors of his imagination first opened their eyes, and once opened, they never closed. Providence was not simply a city of streets and houses. To Lovecraft, it was a map of fear. Every alley, every turn, every silent wall seemed to hold meaning beyond its stone and wood. He walked through its narrow passages not as a child crossing familiar ground, but as an explorer stepping into a realm of shadows, what others passed by without thought. He studied with intensity, sketching the city in his mind as if it were a labyrinth designed to confuse and trap those who wander without care. Benefit Street, with its elegant colonial houses and fine detail, appeared to most as a place of beauty, but beauty to him was only a mask. The houses, proud with their white pillars and tall windows, looked less like homes and more like disguises for things that lurked behind them. He imagined tunnels beneath their floors, where men whispered prayers to beings older than gods, and where rituals took place under flickering candles never meant for daylight. The cobblestones that felt charming to ordinary eyes seemed to him like pathways marked with secret codes, lines leading to doorways that opened not into kitchens and parlors, but into darkness that stretched further than any road. Every street carried a double meaning. In daylight, Providence seemed a picture of New England pride. At night, it became a different city, one where the walls listened and the lamplight revealed more than it concealed. He imagined alleyways that lengthened when one was alone, corners that bent into shapes impossible to follow, and windows that watched as though eyes pressed from inside the glass. To him, Providence was not simply built on earth, but on something older, something unseen, something that used the city as a mask to cover its true face. The churches stood high with their spires, proud symbols of faith to the community. But for Lovecraft, those spires pointed not to heaven but to the void. They looked less like signs of worship and more like signals, beacons reaching upward toward whatever lay beyond the stars. He often stared at them in silence, his pale face lifted, wondering if they were calling to something in the skies, something waiting to answer. The bells rang with steady rhythm, but their echoes carried through him like warnings, as though each toll was less for prayer and more for summoning. The rivers that cut through the city, winding around its edges, seemed to him not natural but deliberate. They looked like veins, feeding the city with more than water. On certain nights, when the moonlight struck their surfaces, he thought he saw shapes move beneath the current, shadows larger than fish, shadows that seemed to rise and sink with intention. He imagined their paths running below the streets, beneath the houses, beneath the very foundations of Providence. In his mind, the rivers were not water alone, but passageways for things that did not belong in human sight. Even the graveyards scattered through the city did not rest peacefully. To others, they were places of mourning and memory. To him, they were markers in a pattern, points on a hidden map. The graves leaned toward each other as though whispering secrets, their inscriptions fading into symbols that only time could erase. He walked among them in silence, tracing their positions as though they formed constellations of the earth. Each stone seemed to belong to a design too large to see fully, a design only the dead could understand. As Lovecraft grew, his sketches of the city turned stranger. He drew alleys as endless corridors, streets as mazes with no exit, houses as hollow shells filled with shadows that looked human but were not. He drew staircases that climbed into nothing, bridges that led into voids, doors that open into spaces without floor or ceiling. Providence was no longer just a city to him. It was a map that pointed to terror, a place where every line, every brick, every spire was part of a greater pattern. The ordinary citizens lived in comfort, blind to the possibility of something beyond their sight. But he felt it always, the sound of footsteps behind him when no one followed, the sudden gust of wind that bent down alleys with no explanation, the sensation that the city itself shifted slightly when he blinked. He carried these feelings with him into his writing, shaping them into stories that seemed too vivid to be born of imagination alone. Providence shaped him not with love, but with fear. It was not fear of simple ghosts or childish monsters. It was fear of vastness, fear of design, fear of living in a place that was not random but deliberate, as though every stone had been placed with intention by hands not human. He imagined the city as a mask stretched over something unspeakable, and that mask grew thinner each time he studied it. Benefit Street became to him a gateway. The spires of the churches became signals. The rivers became veins. The graveyards became coordinates. And the city itself became a map, not for the living, but for forces beyond the living. A map that guided those who knew how to read it toward knowledge too heavy to bear. The boy who once wandered graveyards now wandered streets with the same haunted gaze. He no longer saw Providence as a home. He saw it as a riddle, a puzzle that no one else recognized, a secret written not in books but in stone and shadow. And though others ignored it, he could not. Every night he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking of the patterns he had seen during the day. Every morning he woke with the same thought. Providence was alive. To him, the city was not protecting its people. It was keeping them blind. It offered beauty in its buildings, pride in its history, faith in its churches. But behind those masks, it concealed truths darker than any mind to hold without breaking. He walked its streets each day as if moving through a living labyrinth, a design that he alone could see, a map of fear that shaped not only his imagination, but his very soul. And though he would later write cosmic beings and infinite horrors, it was always Providence that remained at the center, its streets, its alleys, its spires, its graves. A city that taught him to see the world not as a place of comfort, but as a place filled with signals, symbols, and secrets. A city that whispered to him with every step he took. A city that would never let him go. Swan Point Cemetery stretched wide across the edge of Providence, a place where the dead seemed to rest not in silence, but in whispers. The ground was uneven, softened by age, and the gravestones leaned as though bowing under the weight of centuries. Some stood tall and proud, carved with family names that once carried power. Others bent so far into the earth that their inscriptions were almost erased, fading into symbols that looked more like runes and words. To most, it was a place of mourning. To Lovecraft, it was something far greater. It was a threshold. Here lay his family. His father lost to madness. His mother broken by sorrow. His aunts, his uncles, all drawn into the soil that had already claimed so many before them. Each grave was a marker of his bloodline. Yet instead of comfort, the sight filled him with unease. He walked there endlessly, pale against the dark stone, wandering paths that twisted through rows of the forgotten. He did not rush. He drifted, as if waiting for the ground itself to speak. And perhaps, in its way, it did. During the day, the cemetery was strange enough. The elm trees bent low, their branches weaving into canopies that blocked much of the light. The air was always cooler, always heavier. His footsteps echoed more loudly than they should have, and every sound seemed to linger. He would pause often, staring at mausoleums that loomed like small fortresses. Their doors were locked, yet he imagined he could hear faint groans within, as though something pressed against a stone, not from outside, but from inside. At night, the cemetery transformed. The shadows lengthened, and the paths seemed to stretch further than before. A walk that once took minutes felt endless. He would turn corners, expecting to find familiar roads, only to discover new passages, as though the ground had rearranged itself. The mausoleums groaned louder, like the settling of stone under unbearable weight. The grave seemed to shift, tilting toward him as if acknowledging his presence. Some said cemeteries at night felt empty. To Lovecraft, They felt more alive in the streets of the city. He began to write. His pen moved with urgency, pulling visions from his restless nights and long walks among the dead. In his stories, beings rose from beyond death, creatures for whom time was no barrier. Death itself became not an end but a doorway, one that opened into realms vast and terrifying. The cemetery was no longer a place of mourning. It was proof, a stage where the thin line between life and what lay beyond was exposed. He imagined the soil filled not only with bones but with whispers that seeped upward through cracks in the earth, carried by the wind into the ears of those willing to listen. He imagined the dead not as silent sleepers, but as watchers, waiting for their moment to step back into a world unprepared for them. And as he walked, he felt himself part of this exchange, a living figure moving among those who were not truly gone. The graves of his family held him longest. He would stand before them, unmoving, as though their presence lingered in the very air. He traced their names with trembling fingers, reading the fading letters as if they were written for him alone. The silence pressed close, yet it was not empty. It was full, thick with memory, with sorrow, with something unspoken. He carried it with him, back into his house, back into his dreams, back into his writing. To him, Swan Point was not sacred ground. It was a threshold, a crossing place between two worlds. The mausoleums were not monuments, but gateways. The gravestones were not merely markers, but symbols of alignment in some greater design. And the paths that twisted endlessly through the cemetery were not for the living to walk. They were patterns, forming shapes too vast to be seen from the ground. Perhaps from above, the cemetery told a story of its own, one written for eyes not human. Even the trees seemed to conspire. Their branches knotted into shapes that looked like grasping fingers. Their roots pushed through graves as though searching for what lay within. At night, when the wind passed through them, the sound was not the simple rustle of leaves. It was a chorus of low voices, sometimes urgent, sometimes mournful, always speaking in tones that could not be translated. Lovecraft listened, and in those voices he found the seeds of his darkest tales. The longer he spent there, the less he feared it. The cemetery became his companion, his teacher, his stage. He belonged among the graves as much as he did among the living, perhaps more, for in the city streets, he was the pale boy others avoided, the quiet child of sorrow. But among the graves, he was something else. He was the one who heard, the one who saw, the one who carried forward the whispers of the forgotten. Some said it was unhealthy, even dangerous, for a boy to spend so much time among the dead. Yet for him, it was necessary. It was here he found the truth others ignored. Death was not silence. Death was not rest. Death was a veil, thin and fragile, behind which stirred forces too vast to name. He did not seek comfort in that knowledge. He sought understanding. And from that understanding came stories that no one else could write, stories that felt less like invention and more like memory. He described creatures who had lived before men and who would live long after, beings for whom centuries were no more than moments. He wrote of ancient knowledge buried beneath gravestones, waiting to be uncovered. He told of voices that called to the living from below, drawing them toward madness. These were not fantasies. They were reflections of what he felt with every step through Swan Point. Even as he grew older, he returned. His figure, tall and thin, wandered the same twisting paths, pausing at the same leaning stones. Neighbors grew used to it. They saw him there as often as they saw him in the streets. The cemetery was no longer simply a place of the dead. It had become part of him, as though its soil had mixed with his blood. For most, Swan Point was an end. For him, it was a beginning. It was a threshold through which his imagination passed into realms of fear and wonder. It was a place that taught him death was not final, but a door. And behind that door, something vast waited, patient and eternal. The boy who once stood silent among the graves grew into man who gave voice to cosmic horror. Yet even in his later years, the memory of Swan Point remained. The leaning stones, the groaning mausoleums, the endless paths, all of it lingered in his words. All of it shaped the world he gave to others. Providence had many faces, many streets, many secrets. But in Swan Point Cemetery, all of them came together. The past, the present, the silence, the whispers, a place where grief became story, where death became eternity, where one fragile child became the voice of horrors that would outlive even the stones themselves. For him, it was never only a cemetery. It was a threshold between what is seen and what is not, and once he stepped into it, he never truly returned. The rivers of Providence were never silent. They wound through the city with a slow and constant murmur, carrying with them more than water. The Woonasquatucket and the Mashasset curved like dark veins of the land, feeding into the heart of the city, shaping it in ways few noticed. To most, they were only rivers, useful, sometimes beautiful, sometimes dangerous in storm. But to Lovecraft, they whispered of something far deeper. Their waters spoke with a voice that was not of nature alone, a voice that seemed to come from beneath, as though the current carried secrets older than the city itself. He would walk along their banks in silence, his pale face turned toward the black surface. Ripples formed without wind, shapes slid beneath the water. Too vast, too heavy, too deliberate to be fish. Fishermen sometimes told stories when the night grew long. They spoke of nets that tore without reason, of boats that shook with sudden weight, of shadows brushing the hull in ways that made the bravest men go cold. These were not stories told to entertain. They were confessions spoken low, as if afraid the river itself was listening. The Woonasquatucket twisted around the land like a coiled serpent. Its waters, thick and murky, caught the faint glow of lamps from above, reflecting them back as dull sparks that vanished quickly. Lovecraft stared into it and imagined it as more than water. He saw it as a channel, a pathway for things that swam beneath sight. Not fish, not eels, not creatures that belonged to human understanding. Something else, something that moved with purpose, waiting for its moment to rise. The Mashasset was no different, narrow, winding. It crept along the city as though hiding itself, as though choosing carefully when to reveal its presence. At night, it carried an odor of damp stone and something metallic, something that did not belong. He imagined its depths as a threshold, a place with a barrier between man and what came before man was thin. The waters looked shallow, but they held shadows too large for their size. He wondered often how deep they truly went, or whether depth itself was a word that applied to them. In his mind, the rivers were not separate. They were veins of a single body, and that body was Providence itself. The city pulsed with them, fed by them, shaped by them. And if they were veins, then somewhere there was a heart, something unseen, something beneath the cobblestones and brick, something vast and patient. The thought chilled him, but it also fascinated him. For the city lived, then its rivers were its lifeblood, and whatever swam within them was more than animal. It was part of the city's secret soul. He began to write of deep ones, beings neither fully man nor fully something else, creatures that live below, their forms hidden by water, their eyes watching from the dark. He imagined them rising from beneath the cobblestones at any moment, clawing through cracks, dragging the city back into the sea that had birthed it. They were not mindless monsters. They were ancient, intelligent, patient. They had watched humanity grow, and they would watch humanity fall. And in their silent waiting, he saw a reflection of the rivers themselves, always there, always moving, never revealing the full truth of what they carried. The fisherman's stories fed his visions. A boat overturned without storm, a lantern extinguished by a splash with no hand to cause it, nets pulled up empty though they had gone down full. Some spoke of shapes gliding just beneath the surface, following them home, vanishing when they reached the shore. They spoke of eyes glowing faintly in the water, disappearing when confronted, leaving only ripples in their place. No one wanted to believe these tales, but too many told them for them to be dismissed. The rivers were not harmless. They were keepers of something that chose when and how to reveal itself. Lovecraft's imagination made them larger still. He saw the rivers as entrances, passages that led not only through Providence but beneath it. He envisioned caverns carved in secret, chambers filled with water that connected to the sea in ways no man could chart. In those hidden depths, beings waited, beings that had lived for ages and would live for ages more. They moved unseen, their thoughts slow, their patience endless. They did not rise often, but they did not need to. Time was meaningless to them. On nights when the fog rolled thick and the moon hid behind clouds, he swore he could hear the river speaking, not in words, but in tones, in rhythms that pulse against the stone banks. He would stand still, listening, and imagine the sound as a chant, a call rising from beneath the water. It was not meant for him. It was meant for others, for those who swam below. But he listened, and in listening, he felt chosen to carry its echo. He wrote of cities beneath the sea, places of stone and coral where these beings built their own world. He described towers that rose in darkness, carved with symbols no man could read, lit by lights that glowed without fire. He spoke of rituals carried out in silence, rituals that echoed through water and stone until they reached even the rivers of Providence. These were not dreams alone. They were reflections of what he felt each time he stared into the moving black. The idea haunted him. The thought that beneath the familiar cobblestones, beneath the lamps in houses, beneath the laughter of children and the prayers of churches, something else stirred. The rivers were only the surface of it. The truth lay deeper, older, hidden in the water's endless turning. And if the rivers whispered, it was because something in their depths was speaking, patient and certain that one day it would be heard. To most, the Woonasquatucket and the Mashasik were simple rivers. To Lovecraft, they were warnings. They were signs that the world men thought they owned was only borrowed. They were proof that the city itself was not built on stone alone, but on a living secret that pulsed beneath. And though he walked their banks as one man, pale and fragile, he felt always as though eyes watching from below, eyes too vast, too old, too knowing to belong to any creature men had named. Providence had already given him shadows, graves, and whispers, but in its rivers, it gave him something more. It gave him the sound of ancient patience, the promise of things waiting beneath the surface. It gave him the sense that humanity was not alone, and that what lay beneath cared little for man's pride. The rivers flowed on, steady and endless, and as they moved, so did his thoughts. Each ripple, each shadow, each whisper of water against stone carved into him the sense of a presence far greater than himself. It was a call not to him, but through him, a call that he would answer in words, in stories, in visions of creatures too vast to be bound by life or death. The Woonasquatucket and the Mashasik remained, twisting like veins through Providence. To most, they were only water. To him, they were the voice of the city itself. And in their voice, he heard what few dared to believe, the call beneath the city, rising slowly, waiting for the world above to listen. Providence was never only the city people saw by daylight. Behind its polished facades, its colonial beauty, its polite greetings on cobblestone streets, there existed another city, a hidden one, a place of locked doors, shuttered windows, and velvet curtains that concealed more than dust and silence. Whispers spread of gatherings at night, when lamps dimmed and the streets fell empty, meetings of men and women who studied things not meant for open talk. Academics who claimed to seek knowledge beyond books. Spiritualists who claimed they could summon voices from a grave. Occultists who lit their candles and drew their signs, believing they spoke to powers far older than the world itself. Lovecraft, young and restless, caught fragments of these tales. He heard them whispered in corners, spoken by neighbors who never gave names, repeated by older voices who laughed too nervously as they told them. Some swore they were only rumors, the kind of gossip that thrives in old cities where history lies thick in every wall. But others spoke with unease, their eyes darting to the shadows as though afraid someone listened. Providence, they said, was a stage not only for scholars and merchants but for cults, small circles of the devoted, who worshiped forces no human eye should ever meet. The boy's imagination caught these whispers like sparks falling onto dry paper. He began to imagine doors that opened not to parlors, but to secret chambers lit only by flame. He pictured men in black coats standing in silence while one voice read from a book bound in skin. He imagined circles drawn on floors, signs painted on walls, windows covered by heavy curtains so no outsider could see. His mind filled those secret rooms with the scent of burning wax and strange herbs, with a low sound of chanting, with a steady rhythm of footsteps in ritual. He wandered the streets at night, pale and silent, watching houses whose lamps glowed faintly though no one seemed to stir. He studied buildings whose shutters stayed closed even in summer, whose curtains never once moved. He wondered what passed inside. Did families live there in comfort? Or were the rooms taken by others, those who gathered when the city slept? The thought haunted him. Providence was not just a place where he lived. It was a stage, and behind the stage curtain, something else was always being performed. The city's history fed his suspicions. Providence had always drawn exiles, men and women seeking freedom of belief. But freedom carried more than churches and sermons. It carried those who sought answers in forbidden ways. Some followed the stars. Some called on spirits. Some looked even deeper, searching for truths beyond gods, beyond life itself. It was said that meetings took place in basements, in barns, even in the open woods when the moon was full. They spoke of figures cloaked in shadow, kneeling before symbols carved into stone, offering chants not in English but in words too old to trace. Lovecraft never saw these rituals himself, but he did not need to. His mind gave them shape. He imagined the faces of those who gathered, pale in candlelight, eyes wide with devotion or fear. He imagined the sound of knives scratching on stone, of cups raised high with trembling hands. He imagined prayers whispered not to Christ or saints, but to something nameless, something that lay far beyond stars, waiting for the voices of men. The more he thought of it, the less Providence seemed ordinary. Every locked door became a question. Every curtain became a veil. Every sudden silence in the streets became a sign that something hidden stirred. His own house, heavy with grief and shadow, seemed part of the same pattern, as though the whole city was built not for the living but for the rituals of the unseen. Rumors told of books passed quietly from one hand to another, books without titles, books bound in covers too strange to describe, books that spoke of forces older than earth, of beings who waited in silence, of truths too heavy for ordinary minds. Some said these books had come from across the sea, smuggled into the city by men whose names had long been forgotten. Others said they had always been here, written by hands no one could trace. Lovecraft, already haunted by visions, found in these tales a mirror of what he dreamed. He would later write of such books, the Necronomicon, the Book of the Mad Arab. Yet their seeds may have come from the whispers he heard in Providence. And always, he imagined the cults themselves. They were not great armies, not vast orders, but small groups scattered in houses, basements, hidden rooms, each gathering a handful of believers, each voice adding to a chorus that stretched across years. They did not seek wealth. They did not seek fame. They sought only connection to powers beyond man. Some hoped for knowledge, others for favor. But many understood the truth, that what they worshipped did not care for them, did not love them, did not see them as anything more than insects. And yet, still they prayed, still they gathered, still they gave themselves to forces vast and cold. For Lovecraft, the idea was more terrifying than ghosts, more chilling than death. To imagine men and women choosing such worship willingly was to understand that the greatest horror was not only in the unknown, but in humanity itself. That people could seek darkness, invite it, welcome it. That Providence, his own city, was not only haunted by shadows, but by choice, by hands that opened doors to those shadows, by hearts that bowed willingly to them. Walking the streets, he began to see the city not as a collection of homes, but as a theater, a stage where daylight showed the actors smiling, greeting, selling goods, attending churches. But when the curtains fell, when the lamps dimmed, the same actors changed their masks. They entered locked rooms. They whispered forbidden names. They drew circles and symbols and raised voices to beings who cared nothing for their devotion. This double life fascinated him, frightened him, and shaped him. He did not laugh at the rumors. He believed them in his own way. Perhaps not in every detail, but in the heart of it, Providence was more than it appeared. It carried two faces, the polite face shown the world, and a hidden face turned toward the void. And he, pale child of shadows, seemed born to notice a second. In later years, when he wrote of cults worshipping beings from beyond, when he spoke of strange gatherings in distant lands or forgotten towns, he was echoing the whispers he had caught as a boy. The city had given him not only shadows and graves and rivers. It had given him the vision of men kneeling willingly before terror, of societies that chose the forbidden, of secrets passed in silence through generations. Providence was his birthplace. But it was more than that. It was a stage on which secret rituals played. Rituals never meant for human eyes. Behind velvet curtains, behind locked doors, behind the calm faces of neighbors and strangers, something hidden always stirred. The city, with all its beauty and pride, carried in its heart the whispers of forbidden worship. And Lovecraft, restless and pale, carried those whispers with him, shaping them into tales that still echo long after the voices that inspired them have gone silent. For him, Providence was never only a city. It was a map, a labyrinth, a stage, and most of all, it was a place where secrets lived, secrets of men and women who bowed not to heaven, but to the endless dark beyond the stars. As Lovecraft grew older, the world around him seemed less stable, less certain, less real. Providence was no longer only a city of brick streets, tall spires, and colonial beauty. To him, it was a mask stretched in over something unfathomable. Behind its lamps and polished windows, he felt the pressure of something waiting, something hidden. He began to speak of the city not as a place, but as a veil, a cover thrown over truths too dark to face. He would walk the streets in daylight and pause, his pale face tilted to the sky. The sun glowed overhead, yet it did not comfort him. It felt false, as if its light did not belong. It shone like a borrowed lantern in a house that was not its own. The blue of the sky appeared fragile. A thin layer of paint stretched across a wall that trembled. At times, when clouds gathered heavy, he imagined the veil cracking. Beyond it, he thought, there was not heaven or stars, but gulfs. Endless gulfs of blackness where no light could survive. The more he studied the city, the more he sensed that reality itself was weak. The houses leaned at angles too strange for comfort, as though their foundations rested on shifting ground. The cobblestones cracked in patterns that resembled more than age, as though they formed designs too deliberate to be chance. Even the rivers whispered of other depths, as if their currents pulled from beyond time. Providence was alive, but not alive in the way a city should be. It was a shell, a mask, a skin stretched over something greater and darker. His friends noticed the way he spoke of it. They dismissed his stories as imagination, but they could not ignore the vividness of his descriptions. He spoke of places he had never traveled with the certainty of one who had seen them. He wrote of cities under the sea, towers lost to time, skies that opened into infinity. To others, they were fiction. To him, they were warnings disguised as tales. He claimed invention, but those who knew him felt unease. For in his eyes there was no play, no jest. There was only conviction, quiet and chilling. He lived as though the fabric of the world might split at any moment. A walk down Benefit Street became more than a stroll. It became a test of balance, a walk along the edge of something unseen. The tall spires of the churches no longer looked like symbols of faith. They appeared to him as signals, markers pointing upward toward what lay beyond the fragile sky. When their bells rang, he listened not for worship but for summoning. Each sound echoed like a reminder that Providence existed under watchful eyes not human. Even sunlight could not shield him. On bright days, he wrote of light that deceived, light that hid the truth rather than revealed it. He described warmth as a mask stretched across a cold, eternal void. The seasons shifted, spring into summer, autumn into winter, yet he saw in them not renewal but illusion. Nature was a curtain, drawn across something so vast, so merciless, so permanent that no cycle of life could match it. At night, when he looked into the sky, he did not see comfort in the stars. He saw gaps, black spaces between points of light, gulfs too wide for the mind to bear. He felt them pressing down, endless, infinite, ancient. The stars themselves became less like fires of beauty and more like windows, openings through which watchers might look back. For him, the night was not a canopy of wonder, but a reminder how thin the wall was between man and the void. His stories reflected these visions. They were written as tales of imagination, yet they carried the weight of warnings. He wrote of fragile walls cracking, of worlds colliding, of beings slipping through from the other side. He spoke of men who discovered too much, of scholars who read too deeply, of explorers who found doors they could not close. The horror in his words was not of monsters chasing in the dark. It was a reality itself breaking. Friends who read his drafts often remarked on his detail. How did he describe places he had never seen with such certainty? How did he know the weight of gulfs between stars, the silence of endless time, the terror of lightless spaces? He only smiled faintly and called it imagination, but those who sat with him knew better. They saw his eyes, far away, haunted, focused not on the present, but on something just beyond it. They felt as though he had glimpsed cracks in the wall of the world, and what he saw had followed him back. Providence itself seemed to share in his visions. The city was old, its walls heavy with memory, its streets groaning under centuries of footsteps. Yet to him, it looked less like a city aged by time and more like a city stretched across a truth it could not contain. He imagined tunnels beneath its buildings, cracks beneath its streets, holes through which whispers leaked. He imagined the city as a thin crust, and below that crust, something vast, something that pulsed with patience, something that waited for the massed tear. His walks became pilgrimages. Each alley, each graveyard, each river bend felt like part of a puzzle too large to see. The puzzle was not built by man. It was older, woven into the earth itself. He carried notebooks, filling them with sketches of streets, diagrams of spires, patterns of shadows. What others dismissed as curiosity, he knew as necessity. He was tracing the cracks before they opened wide. The older he grew, the deeper his vision became. They no longer came only in sleep or silence. They pressed into his waking hours, slipping into his thoughts when he walked, when he ate, when he sat at his desk. He would pause mid-sentence, his hand trembling, his eyes staring into nothing. Later, he would write again, filling pages with words that seemed less like invention and more like dictation from something outside himself. And still, he told others it was fiction. He hid the truth behind stories, behind characters, behind the veil of literature. Yet his warnings were clear. The world is fragile. Reality is a mask. The sky is not a promise, but a cover. Light itself may be false. He wrapped these truths in tales, but the fear behind them was not play. It was a fear of a man who had seen the cracks and who knew one day they would widen. Those who loved him pitied his frailty, his nervous habits, his solitude. But those who listened closely to his words felt something else. They felt unease, because deep in their hearts, they knew he described with too much certainty. He spoke of things no one else had seen, yet he spoke of them as though they were facts, as though he had glimpsed them, not once, but always. Providence gave him form, but it also gave him vision. It shaped him into the pale figure who wrote warnings dressed as tales. His friends might smile at his imagination, but he smiled back with silence, for he knew what he could never fully say, that the walls of reality were already cracking, and what lay beyond them was patient, always waiting. To him, the city was no home. It was a mask stretched thin over eternity, and the cracks were already there, if one only dared to see. The last days of Lovecraft came quietly, yet they carried a strange weight, as though the city itself was watching. His body was frail, worn down by sickness and hunger, but his mind still wandered through shadows no one else could see. He lived in pain, each step slow, yet when he walked through the streets of Providence, he seemed guided by more than memory. It was as if the city was calling him back, urging him to walk once more through its paths, to see again the places that had shaped him. On those walks, people noticed him, thin and pale, his eyes sunken but alert. He moved slowly, pausing at houses others passed without thought. He touched the walls of old homes with his trembling hand, as though the wood and stone carried voices only he could hear. Perhaps they did. For him, the houses of Providence were not silent. They remembered. They had seen centuries of sorrow and madness, and they had whispered to him since his childhood. Now, as he neared his end, he seemed to listen more closely than ever. He wandered to the graveyards, as he had done since he was a boy. The stones leaned in silence, names half lost to time, but to him, they were not forgotten. He traced the inscriptions with care, his fingers following the letters of the dead, as though reading a message written only for him. The ground was damp, the air heavy, and yet he lingered long, his thin frame hunched but unmoving, as though he drew strength from the earth itself. Those who saw him swore he muttered softly, Names that did not belong to any gravestone. Names that sounded strange, not English, not human. Words that rolled from his lips like fragments of forgotten tongues. When he lifted his eyes to the spires of the churches, his gaze did not hold reverence. It was not worship that filled his eyes, but something more complex, recognition, perhaps. The tall spires cut into the sky, and he stared as though he remembered something they had always signaled. Bells tolled, their sound rolling across the city, but to him, it may have been more than sound. It may have been a call of the city itself. The reminder that Providence had claimed him long ago and was now taking him back. Friends who visited him in his final weeks noted the way he spoke. His words drifted between clarity and dream, between pain and vision. At times, he described memories of his childhood, simple and soft. At others, he spoke of gulfs of blackness, of towers beneath the sea, of watchers who stood beyond the fragile veil of the sky. His voice would lower then, almost a whisper, as if he feared something might hear, and then he would grow silent. His eyes turned toward corners of the room where no one else saw anything at all. His illness left him weak, but his walks continued, as if he could not resist them. He moved like a ghost through the city, passing the same streets he had once sketched in his notebooks, the same alleys he had once imagined as labyrinths. To him, Providence had never been ordinary, and now it seemed even less so. The streets stretched longer, the houses leaned closer, the rivers whispered louder. Perhaps it was his fading body that sharpened his senses, or perhaps the city itself was revealing its final face to him. Those who saw him in those days remarked on his silence. He did not greet often. He did not stop for talk. His lips moved faintly, as though speaking to himself, but those near enough swore the names were not his own. They were names that twisted on the tongue, names no one could repeat with ease. Some dismissed it as sickness of the mind. Others felt a chill, as if he was not only speaking, but answering something that had called to him. On one of his final walks, he returned to Swan Point Cemetery. The trees bent low, their branches black against the pale sky. He moved slowly among the graves, pausing before those of his family. He touched the stones gently, his hands shaking, his breath shallow. Witnesses said he stood there for a long time, his lips moving, his voice low. They did not understand the words, but they carried weight. They sounded like prayers or invocations. He turned then, his eyes sweeping across the rows, and for a moment, those who watched felt that he was not looking at stone or soil, but at something beyond. When he returned home, his health fell quickly. He grew weaker. Yet he remained strangely calm, as though he had accepted what others feared. In his final hours, those close to him recalled that he spoke faintly, his voice barely above breath. He muttered names that did not belong to men, names that rolled with sounds too sharp, too deep, too strange. Some dismissed it as fever. Others believed he was calling to the same beings he had written of all his life, beings that, perhaps, had always listened. And then came silence. His eyes closed, his frail body rested, and Providence claimed him. Yet even in death, the city did not let go. For the people who buried him spoke of the weight of that day. The air seemed heavy, the ground damp though no rain fell. The sky hung low, the spires stood tall, the rivers moved dark. It was as though the city itself had leaned closer, watching, waiting, taking back the one it had marked from the beginning. To some, he was only a man, a writer of strange tales, a dreamer, a lonely figure. But to Providence, he was something else. He was its child, its voice, its witness. From his first steps through graveyards to his last walk along the cobblestones, he had listened to what others ignored. He had seen the cracks, the shadows, the whispers, and in the end, he had carried them back into the earth with him. Did he find comfort in those last moments? Or did he see, more clearly than ever, the truth waiting just beyond? The truth that the city had always concealed beneath its beauty. Perhaps he saw both. Perhaps he knew that his life was never separate from Providence, but bound to it. The city had given him sorrow, fear, visions, and shadows, and in return, he had given it words that would outlive stone. Providence was not done with him. Even in his silence, it carried his memory in every street, every grave, every spire. And those who walk its paths today may still feel it, that faint presence in the air, that whisper in the wind, that sense that the city remembers. For Lovecraft's last walk was not an ending, but a return to the city that had shaped him, haunted him, claimed him, and perhaps always watched him from the shadows. Providence today shines with the face of a modern city. Its streets are busy, its shops alive, its buildings restored with pride. Students walk across its colleges, tourists admire its history, and the rivers reflect lights that glow warm against the night. To the eye, it is safe, calm, a place where past and present meet without conflict. Yet beneath this beauty, something lingers. Those who wander too deep into its crooked alleys, who walk along the rivers when the lamps are dim, speak in air that grows heavy, a silence that arrives without reason, a sense that the city is not simply stone and water, but something more, something aware. The houses stand in quiet rows, but their windows at night sometimes seem too watchful. Their glass reflects not only lamps, but the shape of those who stare into them. Old trees bend above the sidewalks, their branches like arms reaching across the path, and the wind through their leaves often sounds less like movement and more like voices. People laugh, dismiss it, keep walking, but the feeling remains. The city seems to breathe. Providence carries its history in every brick, and history here is not light. Fires burned it, floods tested it, sickness and madness left their shadows in its families. The ground beneath is layered with graves, old and countless, pressed one atop another, and the rivers, still winding, still dark, still whisper with currents that seem older than the land itself. A city can heal, but it can also remember. Providence remembers. For some, it is only a thought. For others, it becomes an experience. A man who takes a shortcut late at night through Benefit Street finds himself lost, though the road is straight. A woman walking home past the spires feels her breath shorten as if unseen eyes are fixed upon her. A child wandering too close to the river at dusk claims to see ripples spreading though no stone was thrown. Strange events that fade by daylight, yet cling to the mind long after. Lovecraft is gone, his body resting beneath the soil he so often walked. But his presence never truly left. His words linger in the city like echoes, shaping how people see, how they think, how they fear. He wrote of horrors beyond human reach, of worlds that crack to the veil of the sky, of watchers who never blink. Yet when one walks through Providence with his stories in mind, it becomes harder to believe they were only imagination. The city itself seems to confirm them. The alleys bend in ways that feel unnatural. The rivers flow with voices too soft to trace. The graveyards expand in silence, their stones leaning like tired figures bowing low. Even the modern lights cannot erase the weight that hangs after midnight. Providence is alive, pulsing, carrying a memory older than its own founding. To walk it at night is to feel the presence of something beneath, something beyond, something that has always been. There's a thought that troubles many who know his work. Perhaps Lovecraft did not invent his horrors at all. Perhaps he described them. Perhaps Providence whispered them to him, pressing them into his dreams, feeding him visions he could not escape. Perhaps the city chose him to carry its truth into words, to give form to the shadows it could not show directly. If that is true, then the city has always been more than stone, more than history. It has always been a living myth. And when you stand in Providence today, with its people and its lights and its daily noise, you may not notice. But if you walk alone, if you stand too long in the wrong place, if you let the silence settle, you may feel it. The air thickens, the shadows lean close, the city seems to pause. Not asleep, not dead, watching, always watching. Providence holds its beauty on the surface, but beneath that beauty lies a secret that has never left. A secret that shaped a boy into a man, who gave fear a new name. A secret that still lingers in the stones, the water, the trees, the graves. A secret that waits for anyone sensitive enough to hear it, to feel it, to know it. The city itself has become part of the myth, part of the horror, part of the living memory. And that is a thought that chills. Not that Lovecraft imagined the unthinkable, but that he may have opened a door through which Providence itself spoke, and through which it still speaks. The city is not finished. The city does not sleep. The city watches still. If you felt the weight of this story, If it stirred something in you, remember there are more such tales, more cities, more cursed places, more hidden myths waiting in shadows. Share this journey with others who love mystery. Let them walk these paths with us. Subscribe to hear more, to step into the next forgotten legend, to see the world not as it appears, but as it whispers. For stories like this are not just told, they are lived in places where history and myth breed together. And Providence is one of them. The city stands, the lamps burn, the rivers whisper, and somewhere in the silence of night, Providence waits.